Yeah, you should do the Zoom cloud then.
Yeah, do it on the cloud.
Okay, I did. It's recording.
All right, super. Well, let's rock and roll. Thanks for being here.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Good to be with you again. I hate that we have to do it by Zoom, but I'm following my rules that I have to follow. In the last week, I ended up testing positive for the COVID virus, and I've had a, I guess, mild case, if you put it that way. Biggest annoyance has been the lack of taste, but that's coming back a little bit. I'm about to maybe 30% now having my smell and taste back, and that was this morning. So I'm finally kind of getting it back, which is kind of nice. But next week I'll be with you in person, because then I'll have done all the quarantine times and met all the requirements, and I look forward to that very much. But so today we're doing it Zoom again, and we are recording this, and you are able to ask questions as you have questions. Don't hesitate to do that, and jump in with something you want to comment on or ask a question about. We'll be able to do that. Today we're starting study number 2, so you hopefully have those in front of you. I didn't check with your pastor or if those are available, but we're doing study number 2, so I'm hoping you have those if you want them. And I have figured out this week how to share my screen so I can do that, and so we'll do that. So you have now in front of you study number 2, and it's up on the big screen now, so we can fill in the blanks. Now, what I can't do with my Mac very well is type in answers or fill it in on my screen. It's not so simple to do, so I'm not going to mess with that. But I will highlight the sections where you're supposed to be filling in blanks and what you're supposed to be doing, so you can maybe see my little cross-shaped cursor there circling 1521, so you get how it's going to work. Next week I'll have my iPad be back with you, and I'll be able to write in answers. But today we'll make it do a little bit better than last week, but not quite where we want to be, but it'll be all right. So today we're going to be looking at the background, the immediate background for the Augsburg Confession. Last 2 times I've been kind of setting up this whole concept of confession, what it means and what doctrine means and what it means to have the dogmas of the church and to be teaching those things. And I've been trying to give you some background there. And we went through just a kind of broad sweep overview of the entire Book of Concord and all the contents of it. And we thought about everything there from the Apostles' Creed all the way to the Formula of Concord and everything in between. Now we're going to zero in on what we're doing in this particular class, which is the Augsburg Confession. And today I'm going to start with a pretty heavy history lesson. So that's what we're going to be doing for the first part of the class today, or maybe all the class. We'll just see how it goes. But a pretty heavy history lesson. That's what pretty much all page 1 of study number 2 is, history lesson. If you flip the page over, you'll see on the back page, we're actually going to get into the content of the Augsburg Confession and go through the articles of the Augsburg Confession. But that'll be after we get through our history lesson first. So if you like history, you're all set. If you hate it, I'll try to make it a little more engaging and you'll endure it with me. And then we'll get into the contents of the Augsburg Confession after we get all this history stuff laid out. Remember, the Augsburg Confession is broken down into what we call articles or sections. And that's what we'll be getting into that as time goes along. So the history. We've already covered some of the history of Luther, I want to hit some highlight history dates with you, some kind of key points. So we already know we've just gotten through Reformation Day just 2 weeks ago. Today was Reformation Day, or actually it was 2 weeks ago. Yesterday was Reformation Day. 2 weeks ago today was All Saints Day. And we celebrated Reformation Day, and we thought a lot about the 95 Theses. The 95 Theses, of course, were posted on the Castle Church door October 31st, 1517. So 1517 is often seen as sort of the beginning of the Reformation. It's always hard to date these things, but that was a significant date. Now, there were other significant dates that happened that we've already passed in our history, the 500th anniversary of things. In 1518, Luther traveled to a place called Heidelberg. And in Heidelberg, he met with some Augustinian monks, part of his order, and he shared a defense of his teaching. They were curious about, what are you teaching? Now, we've heard about these 95 Theses. They made a big uproar all over Germany because of the printing press. We're curious, what are you actually teaching? And so in Heidelberg, Luther laid out more clearly exactly the contours and shape of his Reformation thinking and of his teaching. So that was in 1518 in the spring. And then the Pope has heard about this stuff. He's heard about the Heidelberg Disputation. He's read some of this. He's heard about the 95 Theses. 95 Theses really got his attention because there Luther is challenging the Pope's authority. And so in June of 1520. We already passed that date. We missed the celebration. June 15th of 1520, the Pope released a document called Exsurge Domine. Exsurge Domine, which Exsugre, if you want to spell it, Domine. Exsurge Domine, which means rise up, O Lord. And it was the papal bull declaring Luther's teaching to be wrong. Luther didn't get his copy of it until that fall. It took a while to get from Rome up to Wittenberg, but Luther had 60 days from the time that he would receive the papal bull, Exsurge Domine. He had 60 days to recant, to retract all of his teaching and to come back underneath the fold of Rome and to be a compliant, quiet monk and teacher at the University of Wittenberg. So he had 60 days. And so the next big event, and this we haven't celebrated yet, so keep this on your calendar, December 10th, 1520. So on December 10th, 2020, it'll be the 500th anniversary of a bonfire. And so what Luther did was 60 days after he received the papal bull, 60 days he had to recant. After the 60 days were expired, on December 10th, 1520, Martin Luther and the faculty at Wittenberg hosted a bonfire. And by one of the city gates, they had a big bonfire and they burned papal decrees and they burned papal law and they burned other stuff because the Roman Catholic Church was burning Luther stuff. So they just burned the church's stuff. So they had a big bonfire and burned stuff. And Luther famously threw on the papal bull and he burned the papal bull and so refused to recant. And so that meant that the Pope didn't waste much time on this. So that was on December 10th, that the 60 days had expired. So on January 3rd, 1521, the Pope officially excommunicated Martin Luther from the Roman Catholic Church. And now he was deemed a heretic. He was out. And so that all happened in early 1521. Well, meanwhile, that's going on with Luther and the theology. Meanwhile, the princes are trying to figure out what all this means, and they're trying to figure out how this is going to impact society and their standing with things, because the church and the society were all bound up together. The politics of the government and the politics of the church were just one big mess. That's how it worked. So to have a new teaching that puts you outside of the Pope's power had huge implications politically. And it meant that we weren't going to have unity in the empire anymore. And we started to question about the kind of change of command and who was being obedient to whom. And if you're not going to be obedient to the Pope, what's that mean for the wider society? So everybody was interested in what Luther was teaching, not just theologians, not just common people, but the political rulers were very interested in Luther because this had huge implications. So in 1521, there was a diet at a place called Worms. So that's your first blank to fill in here. 1521, the Diet of Worms. And you've heard of this. It looks just like Diet of Worms, Diet Worms. And Worms was a city in Germany. That's just where we get the name for this. So we have Worms, and the diet meant just a meeting, a gathering. A diet was usually the name for a political meeting, and the imperial diets, these were diets the emperor would call when he would meet with princes, which would be like governors or city magistrates or maybe regional rulers. And these would all get together because this is a feudal society, remember, and we have kind of like power is isolated in certain areas and places, but then they would get together and have these bigger meetings, and these were called diets. Well, the Diet of Worms was long. It ran from January of 1521 all the way until May of 1521. And so the emperor was there more or less that time, and people were kind of coming and going, but they were conducting the official business of the empire in Worms. Luther was summoned to come to Worms and to give an account of what he was teaching. And he went there excited because he thought he was going to be able to show the Lutheran teaching. And he got there, and he was there to appear in April, and he arrived in Worms. And it turned out that all he had the opportunity to do was to recant of his teaching. That's what he was given the opportunity to do. He had no chance to teach, no chance to lecture, no chance to do anything. They basically brought him in, showed him a stack of his books and said, have you written this stuff? And Luther said, yep. And they said, do you recant? And so he asked for a day to think about it. And this is where he gave his famous speech. Yep, they're my books, but I can't recant. To go against conscience or the word of God is not wise. And then he famously, here I stand, God help me. And that was his famous Here I Stand speech at the Diet of Worms. And when Luther did that, it was quite courageous because he'd already been excommunicated in January. And now here he is 4 months later, standing at the Diet of Worms in front of the emperor, in front of everybody with his all the authority and saying, nope, I'm not going to recant. And at that point, he can be declared a heretic and enemy of the state, not only excommunicated by the church, but also an enemy of the state, and could be summarily burned, which is what usually happened to most heretics. Happened to John Huss, happened to others. So when Luther went to Worms, he fully expected he wouldn't return. He fully expected he would die there as a martyr. So when he stands in front of the whole imperial diet and says, here I stand, I cannot do no other, that's very courageous. Now, he had been given safe passage and a few other things had been worked out with his prince, but there was no guarantee that would be kept or to be followed because a heretic's a heretic after all. But he was allowed to leave. And so he left the diet and headed back to Germany. And that's when he was abducted and kidnapped and then was kind of holed up in the Wartburg for a while because his prince, the elector, wanted to keep him safe. And while he was there, Luther got busy working. And that's another part of the story we don't need to get into. But then in May of 1525, the Diet of Worms came to an end. And one of the last things that was done at the Diet of Worms before it concluded was there was the Edict of Worms, which declared Luther an outlaw of the state, an imperial outlaw. So not only is a heretic, he's an outlaw. He can be killed on sight. And Luther lived under that ban for the rest of his life. We forget about that. And we tend to think that, oh yeah, Luther he got married, had kids. Well, he was an outlaw. And he could be killed by anybody, and he'd be considered a friend of the emperor by doing that. So that was a situation for Luther. So in 1521, they'd meet at the Diet of Worms, and that's where Luther and his teaching were outlawed. So that's your blank underneath 1521. Luther and his teaching were outlawed or banned. So in the 1520s, then it seems like, well, Luther's an outlaw. The princes should now just come in. The emperor will just come in, capture Luther, kill him, and we're done. And that's the end of that. And it probably would have been the end of that. And that would have silenced the Reformation very quickly. And the end of Luther, no more Luther. But God in his providence, things were working out differently. And you see God's hand in this in history. Because the 1520s, there were a lot of things going on, which were distractions for the emperor, frankly. And so throughout the 1520s, there were lots of things going on. And the princes, the Lutheran princes like Frederick and Philip and these others who were sympathetic to Luther and sometimes outright supporters of Luther, they were varying degrees of sympathy. They were trying to figure out how to negotiate things with the emperor, how to allow this teaching to go on, how to kind of keep the lid on everything and trying to work things out. So there were all these negotiations going on. And the emperor, Charles, was actually kind of amenable to this because he had other issues he was dealing with. He wasn't just concerned about Lutheran teaching. He was also concerned about political things going on. And he needed the princes in Germany to be cooperating with him with some of these things that he was dealing with. For example, we have several issues that are prompting this. The kind of the concerns he's got. You've got strife within the emperor, within the empire. The King of France is kind of starting to kind of go his own way and is actually challenging Charles for control of the empire. And so Charles is dealing with this King of France and having to deal with that. And there's war with the King of France. Meanwhile, in the East, you've got the Islam is getting really strong. And you've got these Islamic invasions. They actually invaded Vienna in Austria, and they couldn't believe this happened, that you actually had the Muslims had made it all the way into Austria, and they were sure it wouldn't be long before they would be invading all of Europe. And this has got everybody afraid because holy smokes, the Holy Roman Empire is going to come to an end. Here come the Muslims. This is happening in the 20s. And so these things are all going on, and they all prove to be distractions for Charles. So he can't worry about this monk up in Saxony who's causing trouble. He's got bigger fish to fry, frankly. And so the time keeps on going on. Charles would like to deal with Luther, like to kind of handle this, but things just keep on getting in the way of that. So finally, 8 years later, in 1529, Charles calls another meeting, and he reaffirms the ban. So that's your next blank, 1529. 1529, Charles the Emperor reaffirms the ban and says, nope, we're not going to make any room for Luther. We're not going to make any room for this teaching. And so the prince has been hopeful. Maybe we can persuade Charles. Maybe we can, because he doesn't like the Pope either. And maybe he'll stick it to the Pope. And they're hopeful they can maybe get Charles to turn and to come on board with them. But no, he decided not to. He reaffirmed the ban against Luther. And so in response, the princes, these are the Lutheran princes here that I'm circling, filed a formal protestatio. That would be the Latin, protestatio, protestatio. And it looks just like protestation without the N. And this was a formal legal recognition that they were protesting the emperor's ban of Lutheran teaching. They don't agree with this. They want the ability to be able to teach what Luther is teaching. They want their pastors to be able to do these things. They want the concerns that Luther is addressing to be addressed. And so they file a formal protestatio. And of course, that's where we get the word Protestant, because these princes were protesting, filing a protestatio against the ban of Charles, and they don't want that to happen. So that's where we get the word Protestant. It comes from that protestatio that they filed. It was like their formal testimony or a legal, hey, we're not liking the emperor's decision and we want to file an appeal. It's basically like filing a formal appeal, and we want to discuss this some more. That's what they're saying. But remember, Charles has other trouble, and the other trouble, like the problems in France, the problems with the Turkish invading. We've got the power grabs going on in Germany. It's always kind of, different machinations going on, people trying to take control of this thing or that thing. So there's a lot of problems that he's dealing with. The siege of Vienna in 1529 is right there in everybody's mind. Everybody's worried about the Turks coming. And so Charles needs the Lutherans. That's your next blank here. Charles needs the Lutherans. He can't just thumb his nose at them and tell them to take a leap. He has to deal with them. He has got to keep them sort of mollified. And so he's trying to figure out how to kind of keep them on board. So he's got their support fighting the King of France and fighting the Turks. He's trying to work this all out. So then in 1530, this is our next big date we have here. In 1530, another diet is called. There's all these things going on. We've got these problems. We got the Lutherans, we got the Turks, we got King of France. So in 1530, now we're almost 9 years later, another diet is called, an official meeting, and this time it's in Augsburg. And so Augsburg is a little bit further away. I've got a little map here. Let me show you that. There we go. Hopefully you can all see that. So we have Germany, and this is the whole of Germany. Way up here in the top is the North Sea, okay? And so we got that. And then we have the different places of Germany. Today, Berlin would be right about here, just to kind of give you a sense of the scale on this. And down here, you see, this is 100 kilometers. So from Eisleben to Wittenberg is maybe about 80 kilometers, not too far. And this would all be the area of Saxony. Here's Wittenberg, way at the top. So Wittenberg is, of course, where Luther lives. This is where he's teaching. This is where the monastery is. And then a couple other places. Way down here, here's Worms, and here's Heidelberg. So Luther had to travel from Wittenberg all the way to Heidelberg, which was several hundred, maybe 300 kilometers. Remember, you're traveling by foot or by cart if you're lucky. Mostly you walk. Probably Luther walked this time to Heidelberg, the 300 kilometers to meet there. And then he went back to Worms to meet there. And then Wartburg is where he was holed up here by Eisenach. That's where he was kidnapped and kept for a while after the Diet of Worms. But now they're going to go all the way down here to Augsburg. And Augsburg is in the far south, closer to where Munich is. City some of you might recognize today. The Black Forest is down this part, okay, in the southern Germany, down this area. And so Luther travels and going to go down to Augsburg. So on the way to Augsburg, Luther stops in Coburg, and the delegation from Wittenberg, which was princes and a few theologians, Melanchthon and Luther and a few others, and princes from the area, are all traveling together, and they stopped in Coburg, which was a rather significant castle. And they decided that since Luther was an outlaw and was under the papal ban, he would stay in Coburg in the castle, and then the rest of the delegation traveled on down to Augsburg, where they met with the emperor. So that's what they did. So just kind of gives you some idea of the size of things and where things are. So at Augsburg, the delegation comes together and they're going to meet. And Charles summons the princes there to come to confess. He wants to hear from them what they're going to teach, and he wants to know what's really the content of this teaching, and the church wants to know this too. So now they have their chance. So this is the chance that Luther thought he was going to get back at Worms in 1521. Now finally in 1530 they're going to have it. They're going to have their chance to actually lay out the teaching and to confess, but Luther can't be there himself because he wanted to go, but his prince refused to let him go. By this time, Luther is married, he's got children, and so Luther is a little more willing to concede, okay, I don't want to die as a martyr, I've got responsibilities in my vocation. So he stayed in Coburg like he was supposed to do, wrote letters back to Wittenberg, letters down to Augsburg, letters going like crazy from Luther all the time, staying in correspondence with people, but that's where he is. He's up in Coburg, and the princes, with Melanchthon as their chief counselor, are now in Augsburg to make the confession of what they believe. So Elector John of Saxony, he is the key prince up in Wittenberg. Elector John of Saxony, he is an elector, which means he is a big deal prince. There were only 7 electors in Germany at this time, and the electors were the ones who actually chose the new emperor. They would have to agree, have a vote, and they would choose the new emperor. So they had that kind of authority over Charles. You see, this is why this gets complicated. You'd say, well, he's the emperor, he can do what he wants. It's a little more complicated. It's a feudal society. So Elector John's a big deal. He is sympathetic of Luther and very supportive of his Lutheran cause. Not sure he agrees with Luther on everything. Elector John of Saxony liked relics and liked to collect them. And so he's somewhat reluctant, he's not full bore, but he's supportive. And so he enlists the help of some of his key people. He has Martin Luther staying at Coburg, who's helping to craft all this, how we're going to say things. And so number 1 would be Martin Luther. He gets Martin Luther's help. And then number 2 is Philip Melanchthon. Now, I've used Melanchthon's name a lot. To spell that is Melanchthon, Melanchthon. And Melanchthon is just the Latin way of saying black dirt or black earth, because Melanchthon's real name is Schwarzerd, which means black earth. And so he went from the German sound of his name to a Latin sound of his name because it sounded more academic and smarter. It's a little bit like your pastor, Greenwald, which would really just be Greenwood. Or Grunwald, but it would be just Greenwood if you wanted to anglicize it. And so Schwarzerd became Melanchthon. So Philip Melanchthon is down there at the delegation in Augsburg, getting ready to confess. So that's the setup of what's going on. Now, complicating things though, here I have complicating matters, was a guy named John Eck. And it's real simple, John, John Eck, E-C-K. John Eck was a diehard Roman Catholic, and it was a pretty sharp one. He was pretty smart guy and a good writer. And just before Luther's delegation, Luther wasn't there with them, but just before Melanchthon and the Lutheran delegation arrived in Augsburg, and remember, these diets would go for several months. And so the Lutheran delegation arrived in Augsburg in April. The emperor didn't get there until a few weeks later in May. So they finally all get together in Augsburg. But before the Lutherans had arrived, Eck had just published something known as the 404 Propositions. And the 404 Propositions was a long list, sort of like bullet points, of all the teaching of Luther, supposedly. And Eck wanted everybody in Augsburg to know what Lutherans were actually teaching. And he published this, and he used the printing press to publish his 404 Propositions. But what these 404 Propositions did was they jumbled together all sorts of ideas that were being taught at the time. And they jumbled together not only Lutheran teaching, a few accurate things, but they also threw in a few other things. Like they threw in the teaching of, number 1 here, anti-Trinitarians. There were some people already in Luther's time, even before Luther, and now with Luther's teaching kind of catching hold, people were kind of pushing further and coming up with, hey, this is my chance to teach my new crazy idea or my new crazy idea. And there were people who are pushing way past Luther in some crazy things. One of these were the anti-Trinitarians. And the anti-Trinitarians said, well, true teaching is that God is only one. And the idea that there is Jesus fully God and the Spirit being God, no, they're not quite God the same way. And that's what they're teaching. This is flat out heresy, obviously, but that's kind of floating around. And Eck said, yeah, that's what Lutherans are teaching. They're anti-Trinitarian. So that's the first one. Second one, they threw in the teachings of the Anabaptists. That's A-N-A and then Baptist, B-A-P-T-I-S-T-S. Anabaptist is kind of the full traditional name for what we have shortened out just to Baptist, but Anabaptist literally means to baptize again. And the Anabaptists were people who said, well, baptism needs to be a choice of a believer. You've got to know what you're doing. So we shouldn't be baptizing babies. And in fact, if you were only baptized as a baby, that didn't count because you didn't know what was going on anyway. You've got to make a decision. You've got to decide you want to be baptized. And so if you have decided you want to be baptized, now we'll baptize you again as an adult, and this time you'll mean it. That's what Anabaptists were teaching. And obviously we reject that, and Roman Catholics rejected that, but Eck was saying that's what Lutherans are teaching. So he confused Lutheran teaching with Anabaptist teaching. And Anabaptists are teaching other crazy things too, like we don't need pastors, there's no need for clergy. Some Anabaptists were going so far as even to say, you know, Christ is coming again soon, so the laws of the nation don't really need to be followed. And so like marriage laws, those don't really matter. And so some of the Anabaptists were becoming quite licentious and having more than one wife, and it got kind of crazy. And even some cities like this place called Münster went all in on this stuff. And the area princes actually had to come in and put down this rebellion, and it got bloody and messy. And that was Anabaptists doing this stuff. And now Lutherans are being accused of Anabaptist teaching and being licentious and these kinds of things. So that was being taught. Then the third thing that was thrown in there were the teachings of the Zwinglians. That's number 3, Zwingli. That's Z-W-I-N-G-L-I-A-N-S, Zwinglians. And Zwingli is a contemporary of Luther who always pushed things even further. He thought anything that smells Catholic needs to be thrown out. And the way to get rid of the abuses of the Mass are to say that in other words, the Lord's Supper and the Eucharist, the way to get rid of these things being abused is to say that they don't mean anything. So Zwingli was the one who came up with the idea, well, didn't come up with it, but taught it, promulgated it. Zwingli taught that sacraments don't really do grace. It's not really the body and blood of Jesus. That's a Catholic superstition. It's just a symbol. And so when you take the Lord's Supper, you're not getting the body of Jesus. You're not getting the blood of Jesus. It's just reminders. It's just symbols. That's Zwingli. And of course, you know enough to know we reject that outright, and we don't teach that. But Zwingli taught that, and that was what was being suggested. So John Eck, with his 404 propositions, made things really confusing and really hard for Melanchthon and for the Reformers, who are all excited to come and do their Lutheran thing. And in the meantime, you've got Eck telling everybody all this false things that are not true. So the princes, the Lutheran princes who were there with Melanchthon, wanted to straighten this stuff out. And they had two things that were really important to them in the context of the world at this time. The one thing is they wanted to confess their orthodoxy. So that's point number 1 here, their orthodoxy, O-R-T-H-O-D-O-X-Y. They wanted to say, look, we're teaching what the church has always taught. We're not crazy heretics. We don't believe what the Anabaptists believe. We're not teaching what Zwingli believes. We're not anti-Trinitarian. We're not doing that kind of stuff. No, we're Orthodox. We're teaching what has been taught by everyone in all places in all time. That's what we're doing. We're solidly Orthodox. And you see this in Melanchthon's, in the Augsburg Confession. It comes through again and again and again, this look how Orthodox we are. And the second thing they wanted to show was their Catholicity. They wanted to show that they were still part of the mainstream of the church. So they were being Catholic. Now remember, Catholic, little c, does not mean a denomination. It means universal. We're in sync. We're on track. We're not these kind of weird fringe groups like the Anabaptists were, or like the Zwinglians tended to be. We're right down the line. We are still Catholic. And this surprises a lot of Lutherans who assume that, hey, we're our own separate denomination and we need to define ourselves over against the Roman Catholics. And so we think we need to make a big divide there. But the Reformers weren't interested in doing that. And Melanchthon was very interested in the Augsburg Confession of showing the unity and the continuity. Look, we're teaching these things, but these are things the church has always taught. They're Orthodox, they're right. These aren't weird new teachings. These are what we've always taught. They're Orthodox, they're Catholic. And there was an effort to do that. And so it surprises people sometimes because they think the Augsburg Confession is going to be full of all this vitriol and kind of like this affirmation. We don't have to follow the Pope. We don't care about Catholics. Here's everything's wrong with Catholics. And that's not what's in the Augsburg Confession. The Augsburg Confession has kind of a conciliatory tone to it at times and an effort to try to clarify things. Now, there are some very pointed statements about what's wrong, no doubt, but it's the overall tone is not meant to sort of establish a new denomination. We're going to be our own church. The Reformers had no interest in establishing a new church. They didn't want to do that. The last thing Luther wanted was to be a Lutheran. He just wanted to be Catholic, Roman Catholic, teaching what he always taught, Orthodox and faithfully teaching. He wanted the whole church to follow him on that. That's what his hope was early on. By 1530, it became apparent the Pope has no interest in doing this. Charles has no interest in doing this. People aren't going to follow. And so that's when they became compelled to go their own way and start reluctantly establishing their own hierarchy, their own church system, everything. And so through the 1530s, they started establishing their own parallel system of things, but they don't want to initially. So in the Augsburg Confession, there's still this tone of, we're not trying to start a new church. If we can try to reconcile things, we will. And even through the 1530s, there was still hope that that could happen. There were efforts at that. So that's kind of just a little bit of the background here leading up to the actual Augsburg Confession. I've been talking for a long time here. Let me just give you a chance if you're interested. Anybody have any quick questions or clarifications about anything or comments before I jump into the actual text itself, into the Augsburg Confession? Any questions here? So lots of history. I warned you, there's going to be a history lesson today. Hopefully it's, like I said, not too dull. I find it.
Okay, we do have a question.
All right, fire away.
Do you see today the anti-Trinitarianism still going on today?
I can't hear
Did
you.
you catch that? He's asking if the anti-Trinitarianism and Anabaptists, all that, is that still happening today?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, sure. We'll get to that. Actually get into the content. Page 2, we're coming to that. So on page 2, we'll talk about how these things continue on. But yeah, there are anti-Trinitarian groups around today, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons. There are Anabaptists around today, a lot of non-denominational churches.
We lost your audio.
You lost my audio?
We can't hear you right now.
Okay, I'm not sure what's going on because I have not touched anything on my end.
Nothing yet. Can you still hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, go ahead and say something now. I unplugged you from my sound system. No.
Talking, still talking.
That, I don't think that is on our end. I think that might be on your end somehow.
Well, I muted my microphone, unmuted it, and so now I'm working. I've unmuted it, so it should be fine.
Okay, I hear you on my phone now, so maybe we're back.
Okay, good.
Yes, we're back.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. Whatever I did. I don't think I did anything, but whatever. I'm glad we're back. So yes, these things are continuing on. There are anti-Trinitarians today. We have groups like Mormon Jehovah's Witnesses. I will talk more about this when we get to Article 1 in the actual Augsburg Confession. Anabaptists are still around. A lot of our non-denominational friends are really kind of Anabaptist. Some of them a little more diehard than others. The Mennonites and the Amish are hardcore Anabaptists. A lot of our non-denominations are a little less so. Baptists clearly trace their roots back to the Anabaptist tradition. So yeah, they're still around, no doubt about it. Okay, good. Any other questions? Everybody's afraid now after that debacle. They don't want to try another one. All right, let's press onward then. So let's get back to our sheet then. So the delegation then is there in Augsburg, and Melanchthon is the one who is actually penning much of the Augsburg Confession. He's writing it, but he doesn't read it. One of the secretaries of one of the princes actually reads it, and they actually read the entire thing out loud on June 25th, 1530. So that's your blank right here. And that's a huge big day. So June 25, 1530, that's when the Augsburg Confession was read. That's when the Lutheran position was clearly articulated. And there you have it. So the Augsburg Confession was presented. So these princes read and subscribed a German text. They read it in German. And the word is that the papal or the papal delegations and even the emperor were a little concerned about, they don't want the common people in Augsburg to hear this, because everybody is fascinated by this. And you've got people who are, coming in, sitting in the gallery and listening, and you got common people. It's like, this is a huge, big deal, and everybody wants to know what's going on, so they would go and listen. And when it was read, they picked someone with a good, loud voice, and he read it clearly, out loud in German. Charles doesn't know German very well, so he's pretty much bored the whole time, but they had the whole thing read out loud. And they actually moved this meeting to a little small chapel where it couldn't hold as many people, but people were still standing outside, listening at the windows, and eager to hear this. And it didn't take long for the text then to be quickly printed and published and spread all over the place. And that became the Augsburg Confession. And it was read then initially in German, but Melanchthon simultaneously presented a copy also in Latin. So that's your next blank, in Latin. So the German text was read, but the Latin text was what was handed to Emperor Charles and said, here you go. This is our Augsburg Confession. And that was in Latin. So Latin was what the papal delegation would have had to study, and that's what the emperor would have had to read, but they also did it in German, both at the same time. So that's the Augsburg Confession, and that's where it came from. And that's the whole history of where it came from and how we got there. And that's why the princes are involved. And it was subscribed by the princes. It was a political document, and yet it's a theological document. Now, Philip is the main author, and Philip saw the Augsburg Confession as a sort of mission statement. And that's what you can put here in these quotes, a mission statement, or a personal confession. If you'd rather put that in there, you can put that too. But it was like his own personal mission statement. It was his personal confession. He saw that he was the author of it, and he saw this is a declaration of what I believe, this is what Lutherans believe, and that's what this is. This is a mission statement. And since he saw it as his own personal mission statement, he kept on trying to improve it. And so that's the next blank here. He kept on trying to improve it. And it went through different editions. And he didn't see himself tinkering with it or messing with it. He just thought he was making it better. It's sort of like when I write something and I write one draft, and then I get an idea to how to make something a little better. So I change that and I'll make a different draft. And then maybe later I'll come back to it again if it matters enough to me, and I'll make another change. That's what Melanchthon's doing. So, or like I would maybe do with a class syllabus. You always kind of tinker with it. So Melanchthon is tinkering with the Augsburg Confession and making little changes. And so we have different editions that come out. In 1533, there was another edition. In 1540, another edition. In 1542, another edition. So Melanchthon keeps on messing with this, and all these other new variations became thus the ... after the ellipsis you would write in the Variata, Variata. Variata is a Latin word. It just means the variations, the other texts, the alternates. So the Variata. And so the Variata were other editions of the Augsburg Confession, which had some of these changes in there. So they're not all insidious and bad, but in the late 1500s, we have some theologians from Geneva in Switzerland who are much more Calvinist and much more Reformed, and who are going a little further from Luther, especially on the sacraments. So the Geneva theologians are not quite as full-blood as Zwinglians, but they're leaning in that direction. And they don't see the sacraments as actually being the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, actually being the body and blood of Jesus in a physical, real way, but in a sort of just spiritual way. So they talk about a spiritual presence of Christ, whereas we would talk about a true sacramental presence of Christ with his bread and the body and blood in the bread and wine. And the Calvinists didn't like that. And the Geneva theologians in the late 1500s were able to use some of Melanchthon's wording in the Variata to find common ground. And so some of the Lutherans said, whoa, not cool. And so now it became a debate about which Augsburg Confession are we going to use. And that's one of the reasons why the Book of Concord actually goes back to one of the earliest editions, and they use one called, which one is in the Book of Concord? They use one called the Editio Princeps, the principal edition. So Editio Princeps, Editio Princeps, Princeps, or one of the earliest edition, or often also known as simply the unaltered Augsburg Confession. The unaltered Augsburg Confession. That's what's in the Book of Concord. And that became the official one that was accepted by the Lutherans who were real Lutherans, the unaltered Augsburg Confession, or simply the UAC. How many of you have ever seen a church, an LCMS church, with a cornerstone that has UAC on it, or maybe UAC over the front door as you go in? Anybody ever seen that? Raise your hand. No hands. Seriously? Oh, man. You need to make a trip down to Perry County. And when you go down to Perry County and visit some of the old LCMS churches down there, look at the cornerstone. And in fact, I encourage you to do that. If you go to any LCMS church anywhere in the Midwest, look at the cornerstone. If it's an old church and look at the cornerstone, you will frequently see UAC. And UAC means unaltered Augsburg Confession. And so it was that church, those people, that congregation saying, look, we're real Lutherans. We're holding to the real Augsburg Confession, not these variata, not these ones that Melanchthon maybe toned down a little bit. No, we're going for the real deal. So the UAC means unaltered Augsburg Confession, the 1531, that edition, that one. The actual Augsburg Confession that was presented to Charles in Latin and the one that was read from German have been lost. We don't know where the original ones are. They probably were destroyed. They've been lost. We don't have them. But we do have copies, extant copies from this time period of some of these earliest editions of the Augsburg Confession. The seminary library here in St. Louis actually has quite a few of these because we have a rare book room and have collected several of these. Some of my colleagues, like Dr. Kolb, are really into this stuff and they like to go and study these original documents, which is kind of cool because they're almost 500 years old, these books that we actually have from that time period. So we've got good copies and we know exactly what was actually in these editions. So which language is normative? Is the German normative or is the Latin normative? Which one is the real text? Because there are some differences. Well, the answer is both. Both are normative. The Lutherans in the Book of Concord decided not to make a decision which one was going to be the normative one, and so they put them both in. So already in the earliest editions of the Book of Concord, the Augsburg Confession would be published in both German and Latin, and you would have both of them there side by side because there are some differences, subtle things. The basic message is the same, but the way you say things might be a little different. So rather than choosing the German over the Latin or the Latin over the German and letting one go, they decided both would stand as normative. So if you ask the question, which is the official language of the Augsburg Confession, it's both German and Latin together. So that means that in most of your English editions of the Augsburg Confession, you will usually have two English translations side by side. One is a translation of the Latin text, one is a translation of the German text. I don't think the Reader's Edition does that. The Reader's Edition of the Book of Concord, I think, just settles on one or the other, and I think they kind of follow, if I remember, the German, but I could be wrong on that. But the more authoritative translations, like the Tappert edition, we've talked about that. Tappert had German and Latin together, and they did them top and bottom. And I forget which is which. I think the German is on top of the page, Latin on the bottom, or maybe vice versa. Kolb-Wengert does them side by side. It has the German on the left side, on the verso page, and then on the right side of the page, it has the Latin text translated into English for us. But that's what it is. So what's in this then? The contents. There are 28 articles in the Augsburg Confession, 28 articles. Now, the 28 articles weren't part of the original text. When Melanchthon wrote it and presented it, it was just one long text. There were no breaks, there were no headings, there were no bullet points. It was just one long text. Very shortly, though, after that, within some of the earliest editions, already like the Editio Princeps and some of these others, they'd already made breaks in there and had numbered them and given them titles. But the titles and the numbering weren't part of the original first oldest editions of this, the original ones. They were added later. But when they broke it down, there were 28 articles and they cover 69 pages. So 69 pages in KW. KW is Kolb-Wengert. And remember, that's the edition of the Book of Concord I'm going to be using. And that's from the from 2000 is when that came out. So 69 pages. Now keep in mind, you say 69 pages. Well, that's a lot. That's long. Well, not really. It's 69 pages compared to 500 in the whole book of Concord. That's not very long. But keep this in mind as well. Remember, 69 pages. It's got German on one side and Latin on the other, so you can whack it in half for the total length of it, actually. So now we're down to about 35. And now keep also in mind, the first 21 articles are the real guts of the actual confession. They state the doctrine of the reformers. So that's your blank here, doctrine. The first 21 articles, the final 7 articles defended specific changes in church practice. And so there's a real mark. In fact, there's actually a conclusion to the first part, the first 21 articles. And then Melanchthon has a transition. He says, now in these next articles, we're going to talk about some of the changes in practice over some of the abuses. And those are much longer discussions, like why we're doing communion in both bread and wine and not just the bread. Communion in 2 kinds, we say. And there's also a long discussion about the limits of ecclesiastical authority, that bishops don't have the right to have armies, and that the Pope shouldn't be telling the princes what to do. So we have a discussion about that. There's a long discussion about monks and the monastic vows. So there's all these kinds of things that are hot issues at the time are discussed there, which frankly aren't that interesting to us anymore because they really aren't big issues. But the first 21 articles are where the real doctrine are. And the first 21 articles only cover 23 pages in Kolb-Wengert, and that's both German and Latin. So you cut that in half. That means we have maybe 11 pages total of how long the Augsburg Confession is. So you see, it's not a long document, and that even includes long footnotes in Kolb-Wengert. So if you take out the footnotes and go with just one language, you can probably boil down the doctrinal part of the Augsburg Confession into maybe 9 pages or even less on, depending on your font, but it's not long. So in other words, it's not a long, monstrous essay. It's a rather tight, concise confession. And people have this idea that, it's all this heavy-duty doctrine and it's all confusing. No, it's really not. So don't be intimidated by it. That's why we're going to actually get into this. It's actually quite manageable. So that's what we're going to be looking at as we get into going forward in this. All right. Any questions or comments at this stage? Okay, nothing. So I got a couple minutes left and then we'll wrap this thing up this morning, but I want to give you an idea of how this looks. So here's how Kolb-Wengert actually looks. This is what the text looks like. So we have the German on the left and we have the Latin on the right, side by side. And this is what the text looks like. And it starts with the preface. And the preface is a long explanation of what we're going to be doing. And the tone, let me just read a little bit of this. The Augsburg confession of faith by certain princes and cities presented to his imperial majesty in Augsburg in the year 1530. And here's how it starts. We'll read the German. Most serene, most mighty, invincible emperor, most gracious Lord. A short time ago, your imperial majesty graciously summoned an imperial diet to convene here in Augsburg. The summons indicated an earnest desire first to deliberate concerning matters pertaining to the Turks, those are the Islamic invaders, that hereditary foe of ours and of the Christian name, and how this foe might be effectively resisted with unwavering help. And second, to deliberate, quote, and diligently to consider how we may act concerning the dissension in the holy faith and Christian religion, and to hear, understand, and consider with love and graciousness everyone's judgment, opinion, and beliefs among us, to unite the same in agreement on one Christian truth, and to lay aside whatever may not have been rightly interpreted or treated by either side, so that all of us can accept and preserve a single true religion. Inasmuch as we are all enlisted under one Christ, we are all to live together in one communion and one church. That's what the emperor said when you came to Augsburg. And now here the princes say, because we, the undersigned elector and princes, including our associates as well as other electors, princes and estates, have been summoned for these purposes, we have complied and can say without boasting that we are among the first to arrive. And they were. They got there several days before the emperor arrived. So that's how the preface starts. And so they goes for 2-3 pages, and then finally gets into the actual text. So this is kind of saying what we're going to do, what we're going to confess, what we want to get at. And then finally we get down here to Article 1, the chief articles of faith. And now Melanchthon takes over and he starts writing this part because he didn't really write the preface. Others were involved in that. And now we get Melanchthon, and now we're set up for where we're going to start next week, which is the actual content of the Augsburg Confession, starting with Article 1. And that's where we are. Perfect time to close. Let's close with a word of prayer. Lord God, thankful for your faithful men who were courageous, even against strong odds, but they confessed your truth. Help us to be courageous in our day, to stand up against any odds we see and be able to speak your truth without wavering, and to be joyful in the wonderful clarity of the doctrine we have and the truth that brings to our lives. Guide us and direct us this week as we serve those around us. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. All right. Good. Thank you for your time. Blessings on your week ahead. And next week, I'll see you face to face, and I'll look forward to that. Take care, guys. Blessings on your week.
Thank you, Dr. Biermann.